Hey everybody, and thank you for joining me for this extended interview with Sarah Werner. So I'm gonna do a quick intro. Sarah, you jump in if I miss anything, but you're a professional writer, speaker, and podcaster who left a decade-long career in marketing to pursue creative passions.
Absolutely.
So, we currently live in South Dakota, and an interesting note I found that you live on the edge of a graveyard.
I do.
So
I do.
What is that like?
It's peaceful, and I love it.
It's peaceful.
The two brothers who own the graveyard gave us permission to build a gate into it, and so now we have our own little personal gate into the graveyard, and we walk back there, and it's so peaceful. And
that has to help with the creative juices.
It kind of does.
Get some flowing.
Little Edgar Allan Poe sort of vibes.
Nevermore.
Yeah.
Raven
yeah.
Nevermore.
Yeah.
So,
it's not creepy.
No, not at all. So, Sarah, you're also a creator and the host of the Right Now podcast, which helps aspiring writers to find work-life balance while pursuing creative passion. So, I also read that you do some, you cover podcasts for Forbes a little bit. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So let's see. So it all started with the Right Now podcast, and I got that show off the ground. And like you said, it's for writers, and it's a nonfiction show. And so as I was looking to grow my podcast and to get better at it, I joined a group on Facebook called She Podcasts. It was for women podcasters because at the time when I started Right Now in 2014, 2015, there weren't a lot of women in podcasting. And there were a lot of people who said women can't do podcasting because vocal fry and all of these other stupid little things. And so I joined the support community to talk about issues that women face in podcasting. And as I was in that community, I was paying it forward. I was helping other people. And an editor from Forbes was in the group with me. And nobody really knew that because she was just lurking. And she contacted me and said, hey, I'm from Forbes and we're looking for a woman to cover podcasting. And you've been really helpful in this community and you're already podcasting about writing, so how would you like to write about podcasting? And I was like, okay, that's kind of perfect. And is this real? But also it was real, and so
wasn't a dream.
So now I get to do that, and it's been fantastic. But yeah.
So with that, how did Girl in Space come about?
That is a very good question. So I had been doing the Right Now podcast for about 3 years, and so that's a traditional nonfiction podcast where I talk about writing and all of that good stuff. And I was sitting at my desk recording an episode of Right Now and just thinking, like, what if everything I said was a lie? Like, what if I said, like, yeah, I'm recording from space today, and it's really beautiful, and I was like, oh, wait, why shouldn't I be doing that? Like, why am I not doing this? And so I was like, well, basically I've invented fiction podcasting, which no, I didn't do. It turns out there's a huge fiction podcasting community out there, and I'm very grateful to all the people who helped me start the show. But yeah, it basically came from me seeing the success of a podcast over a blog with Right Now. And then I was like, well, I'm already doing all this writing. I love creating fiction. I wonder if I could find the same success in fictional podcasting that I did in non-fictional podcasting. And the show took off. It made it to the front page of iTunes the week it launched. It's been amazing. It was featured on Spotify for a time when it first launched. So it's just been crazy successful in a way that it wouldn't have been if it were, I think, a book or another traditional published piece of media.
So they say if you love what you do, no day will feel like work. So I have a little bit of insight on what goes into the Girl in Space podcast, but can you tell us what the creative process looks like for you? Like how many hours you put into it, just the research and reaching out to different hosts and things like that.
Absolutely. So for my two shows, it's a little bit different for each one. So for the nonfiction show Right Now, the process basically looks like I brainstorm some topics, and I usually try to keep about 30 topics in a spreadsheet. So like, what to do if you have writer's block, or listening to music while you write, does it help? Like all of that good stuff. And then what I'll do is when I'm ready to record, I'll sit down, I'll brainstorm for about 30 minutes, do the traditional 5-paragraph paper style of thesis, 3 points and a conclusion, and then I'll sort of start recording, talk from there, and then I will edit the episode and then send it out to the RSS feed. For that show, it takes me between 8 and 15 hours to create a 30-minute episode of the Right Now podcast. Girl in Space is slightly different. And I mentioned in the shorter version of this interview that it usually takes me between 60 and 80 hours to create a 30-minute episode of Girl in Space. And it's really disheartening. It's sort of like making a big Thanksgiving dinner. You know, you spend like 20 hours like making all this food and cleaning your house and like getting people over, and then they sit down and they demolish the meal in 10 minutes. And you're like, seriously?
Yeah.
This took me like days. And so it's a little analogous to that. But the creative process for Girl in Space, so there's a lot of different ways you can write creatively. There's people called plotters, and then there's pantsers. So plotters outline the whole thing, and they like maybe write it in advance. They know how it's going to end. And then there's pantsers who write by the seat of their pants, and that's me. And it's not the smartest way to do anything. So basically, I just started writing episode 1. When I finished episode 1, I figured out how to, record it. I put in sound effects, music. Got another actor to do a part, wove them together so it sounds like they're actually talking in the same room to each other, and then distributed it, marketed it, all that stuff. But and then I do that for every episode, so I don't have them all written in advance, and they come out as I write them, which again I would not advise doing because it is really stressful. It's like trying to outrun an avalanche. But yeah, it's a lot of work. Right now I'm on the finale of season 1. I'm writing that. And currently, it's a little out of control. I'm on the 8th draft, and I'm on page 51 of that. And I've probably put in over 100 hours just writing this episode so far alone. And so it's a lot of work. But like you said in the beginning of the question, if you love what you do, is it really work? And the answer is yes, it's absolutely a ton of work. And I say that facetiously. It's a ton of work, but if you love doing it, it energizes you instead of draining you. And so I like to say that, like, yes, it's still hard work, but it's fun and it fuels my heart, and that's really important.
So you weren't always in just the strictly podcast creative realm. You have some experience in the marketing background, but how has that helped with your Girl in Space podcast? And even any other podcasts or any endeavors that you decide to jump into?
That's a great question too. I feel like when I first graduated college, I had a degree in creative writing, and I was very anti-marketing. I was like, oh, that's where you go to sell your soul, and marketers or whatever. And then I went into marketing for 10 years, and now I came out the other side, and I'm like, marketing is really helpful because a lot of people don't even think about marketing their podcast. They're like, oh, if I create it and if I launch it, it'll be in iTunes, and then everyone will find it. But that's not necessarily true. You have to do a lot of work marketing your show, from creating a Twitter account or Instagram, finding some kind of social media that's a good fit for your show, creating a website for your show, and then reaching out and networking with people is extremely important. Mm-hmm. The number one way that podcasts are still marketed is word of mouth. You can go out and you can buy Google ads and you can do Facebook ads and all that stuff, but really the way that you're going to get your best and most passionate listeners is from referrals from other listeners. And so one simple way of marketing your show that doesn't cost any money is just making sure you have a call to action at the end of each episode. Mm-hmm. Hey, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or someone else who would benefit from it, and kind of going from there.
So again, on the topic of growing your listeners, what's the best frequency you think it is to release podcasts in order to help aid that effort?
Oh boy, what a great question, because I've seen a lot of different things work. And so this is going to be kind of a complicated answer. So Pat Flynn does the Smart Passive Income podcast, and he releases an episode every day. Oh. But they're 5-minute episodes, right? So it's like he can do that because they're smaller episodes he releases every day. You get more downloads, obviously, that way because you're releasing a new episode every day to the same audience.
You have more content.
Exactly. So what I usually do, and then you have people like Dan Carlin, whose Hardcore History comes out, months go by before he has a new episode out because his episodes tend to be like 5 to 6 hours long. Mm-hmm. And so it really depends on what your workflow looks like and what your audience wants and expects from you. Basically, if you set an expectation, you need to follow up with it. So if you say this is going to be a weekly show, then it should be a weekly show. Which was a big mistake that I made when I initially came out with Girl in Space. I'm like, yeah, this is going to be a weekly show. And then I was like, it's going to be bi-weekly. And then I was like, it's going to be monthly. And now it's March, and I haven't had an episode come out since last December. So consistency is good and important. Expectations you set are important. I would say a window is you might want to release either weekly or up to monthly, but I wouldn't maybe go past that unless you have sort of an outlier show like Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. It's really hard to retain listener interest if you're coming out with a show like quarterly or annually. I think that's a little bit too much of a stretch. Monthly might even be too much of a stretch. So
another thing you said, like trying to keep your audience interest. How do you do that when you decide you wanted to have on a special guest? And how frequently would you suggest having special guests on the podcast?
You know what I found is that podcasting is so unique. Podcasting is, I've called it this before, a cult of personality. And the reason that people want to listen to your podcast is because of you. Mm-hmm. And so I experimented a little bit with the Right Now podcast. So I do Right Now episodes, which are just me monologuing and talking about a topic that I'm struggling with. And then I also introduced a sister show called Coffee Break, in which I interview writers. And I was like, oh my gosh, these interviews, they're going to go through the roof because the person that I invite on is going to do co-marketing and this is just going to blow up. And it didn't. And I actually got people saying, when are you going to come back with the monologue episodes? Because we're here for you. And so that was mind-blowing for me.
It's important you brought that up because one question I had was like, how do people generally catalyze podcasts? Is it just, do more people flock to the monologues? Do more people flock to the interview styles? How does it usually play out, do you see?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I can say that from the creator side, I think more people create interview podcasts because it's less work. Mm-hmm. Because you get better chemistry. If you're talking with someone like this, it's a lot easier to have a flow of ideas. You don't have to worry about scripting anything out. You're not alone talking to a microphone, which I think a lot of people find weird and unsettling. But really, when you're doing that, when you're monologuing, you're not monologuing. You're having a direct conversation with the listener. And so I feel like it's a little bit more intimate because there's not a filter of another person for the conversation to go through, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, I would say that the monologue podcasts tend to be a little bit more intimate. But again, you have people who are just good interviewers, like Joe Rogan. He's a good interviewer, and that's why his show is so successful. And so I don't want to leave this with a qualified answer, well, it's kind of up to you and how good of an interviewer you are. Right, exactly. But it does depend. And what I would say is ask your listeners what they like. I did several polls because I had started getting this feedback that people preferred just me monologuing over my guests. And I did a poll and I said, what do you prefer? And it was, we want more of the Right Now episodes. And so just have open communication with your audience and say, what do you guys prefer? I've tried doing a few interviews. Do you like them? Are you finding value in them? And just sort of going with that. At the same time, it is easy for monologue podcasts to become very indulgent. Mm-hmm. And speaker focused instead of audience focused. So do make sure if and when you do a monologue podcast, when it's just you and the mic, that you're not doing it to be self-serving, that you're doing it to serve your audience. That's how you'll have a successful monologue show.
So with the monologue show and serving your audience, how do you find the content that your audience wants? So do you call for questions across social media? Do you put up polls? How do you get your audience involved with those monologue podcasts?
Oh, that's a great question. Usually when I started and I didn't have an audience to poll, I just did things that I thought were interesting. Usually if you're talking about something that you're interested in and passionate about, people will catch on to that passion. Mm-hmm. As long as you're doing it, again, not to be indulgent, but to serve others. I think that's really key. But as my audience started to grow, I did start to poll people. I started asking questions on Twitter. I started going to writing forums and just like scanning, like, what are people asking? What do people want to know? What are people struggling with? What are some pain points I can help people solve? So I joined a number of writers groups and just sort of kept an eye on how people were talking about their own writing. And then I started my own writers group, and I get questions in there like, hey, I'm really struggling with distributing my book. And so I'm like, oh, that's a great subject for my podcast. And it addresses a direct question that my audience members have, and it's a great way to do it.
How would you measure success with your podcast? I know if you have the passion to do it and you're doing it, you can say that's my measure of success, but how would you measure success in your opinion?
Great question.
It's different for everybody.
It is different for everybody. It is absolutely different for everybody. And it really, I think it hinges on why are you starting your podcast in the first place. So there's so many different metrics of success. I'm going to talk with my hands a little bit. And that goes from numbers. Numbers are the easiest to measure. Mm-hmm. And I think that is where a lot of people look for their success. And so they're like, oh, I only have 2,000 downloads an episode. I don't have 1 million, and so I'm not successful. That's not true at all. If you set a mission when you're first starting your podcast and you say, my mission is to help people, and then in accordance with that mission, if you set your success metrics to be in accordance with that, then I think that you'll find that you are having more success. So an example, because that was kind of convoluted, is so for me with the Right Now podcast, or you know what, we'll use Girl in Space. For the Girl in Space podcast, my mission statement is that I want to let people know that they're not alone. Like, that is why I created this show, because I was seeing a lot of isolated people looking for representations of themselves in media. And so I created a character who struggles with isolation and loneliness. And success for that, like, my numbers have been very successful, but that's not how I measure the success. For that, in relation to my mission, which is helping people not feel alone, I look at the fan mail I get, and I see people saying, like, thank you for this show. I had one this morning that broke my heart, and it's just people saying, like, you know, this show gives me hope. I see myself in this show. I wouldn't be able to get through today if it weren't for your show. So for me, that success is knowing that I'm fulfilling my mission and helping people not feel alone.
Finding your why.
Exactly. It's finding your why, and it's knowing that it's not a comparison game. And that's the other thing, is it's easy to compare. Like, even beyond the numbers, like, oh, you got 3 pieces of fan mail? Well, I only got 1 piece of fan mail this week. Don't compare. You're running your own race, and you're doing your own thing, and you're helping people in the way that you can, and that is what matters.
Yeah. Life is tough enough as it is. There's
exactly.
no need to compare.
No. So stop that.
Stop that. So, I guess my next question is, how would you start? Like, if a person was thinking about starting a podcast right now, what would your advice be to them to get started with this?
Absolutely. So I would start with brainstorming. I would suggest, and this is like assuming that you don't have a topic or a title or anything. If you're just like, hey, I should probably start a podcast, think about, what do you love to talk about? Surprisingly, one of the questions I get asked the most is, Sarah, I have 3 different things I want to podcast about, and I'm not sure which one to pick. And my answer is, which one is the most fun? Because it's so easy to pod fade. It's so easy to give up because it's a lot of work. Make sure you're having fun while you're doing it. So pick something that you love talking about. Pick something that will resonate with your projected audience that maybe doesn't exist yet. And then it's as simple as getting over the fear, which for me was a lot. When I started Right Now, I was so intimidated by the thought of, like, oh, I'm going to have to get a mixer, and I'm going to have to figure out XLR microphones, and I'm going to have to do this and this, and don't let that get in your way either. You can podcast. We were having a conversation earlier here in this room. You can podcast just with your phone. If you download the Podbean app and you talk into your phone, you can release podcasts from there. So I would suggest really figuring out what resonates with you, brainstorming some topics, building a little bit of an infrastructure like we talked about earlier to support you for success. So making sure that you have at least a Twitter account or something that you own, preferably your own website, You can throw up a splash page. I'm making this sound really simple. It's a lot of work, but it is, as far as media goes, it's a very low barrier to entry.
So, to wrap this up, can you tell us a little bit about your masterclass and what you got going on there?
Yeah, so hey, this dovetails nicely. If you are looking to start your own podcast, I would love to help you out. I have launched the Podcast Now Masterclass, which offers 52 video lessons. That's right, it's a lot of lessons. And it basically walks you through everything you need to know to create not just a podcast, but a successful podcast. So I take my 10 years of marketing experience and I wrap that up with my podcasting expertise, and I walk you through, how do I choose a topic? How do I choose a name? How do I build a website for it? Where should I build my website? How do I create an RSS feed? How do I find my audience? How do I speak to my audience? How do I market my show? All of that good stuff gets wrapped up all together. You can find the Podcast Now Masterclass. I offer it 3 times a year in February, June, and October. And you can find that out at my website, sarahwerner.com. That's SARAHWERNER.com. Thank you for asking me about that.
No problem. I'm trying to sign up to it myself. All right, Sarah, I'm out of questions, but thank you for taking the time to speak with us today with this extended interview, and be sure to look out for Sarah on the podcast we have coming up. We're going to talk more podcasts.
Awesome. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you for having me today. This has been a delight.